Today is February 1st, the first day of Black History Month, and I thought I might start that off on my channel by talking about one of my heroes, who is Ida B. Wells. She is the reason I ended up double and triple majoring at my university. So one of those majors was communication with a concentration in journalism. So she was arguably our nation's first investigative journalist. Now, you may have heard me just say Ida B. Wells, but she's properly Ida B. wells-barnett, Wells being her maiden name and Barnett being her marital name. So, born in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Lord have mercy. Into slavery. So she's this very turn of the century type of figure. So when you're talking Ida B. Wells, you're talking late 1800s, early 1900s. So at 16 years old, both of her parents die, as well as her youngest sibling, who was an infant, and they all succumbed to yellow fever. So that is, something that was, endemic, epidemic, it wasn't pan, it was, in their area. So of course, amazingly, when there were talks of foster care and fostering all these children out into different homes, Ida B. Wells was having none of this. So the 16-year-old moved her family out of state, and took up a job as a school teacher and used that income to care for her siblings. I believe it was after another one of her siblings passed away, this time a sister, that she ended up moving herself and her siblings in with one of her aunts and taking care of the family that way. There are aspects of African American history that are so gruesome that I have to take small breaks in between to compose myself. So anyhow, Ida B. Wells wrote Southern Horrors, lynching in all of its phases. So this pamphlet chronicled all kinds of lynchings, and this is why some people refer to Ida B. Wells as the first investigative journalist, because she would compile all of this information and interview witnesses and family members and gather up all the information and then present it, which was new for people back then, because unfortunately so much of the news and so much of what was just written based off of the word of a man, usually a white man, and oftentimes a liar. So she would go and collect the truth, and when you're a person who speaks truth to power, which is how she lived and died, you become a target. So for the sake of her people, she became a living, moving target. So she chronicled these lynchings wherein, how do I say this? There are so many conversations that we have with people, and people are like, oh, you African Americans are crying about something that happened 400 years ago. Get over it. African Americans did not gain civil rights in this country until the late 60s, the late 1960s. So really, African Americans are suffering from what happened, maybe a couple of grandmothers ago if you're a millennial. Okay. Anyhow, so these lynchings were extrajudicial killings to basically enforce the white supremacist idea that blacks ought to be second-class citizens. So when it comes to who to target for a lynching, they would target something that they referred to as an uppity Negro. This is literally why my channel is called Uppity Unicorn, because it's a dedication to the people who lost their lives so that I could have one that is dignified. So when African Americans refer to one another as uppity, we mean high sedity, highfalutin, self-important, arrogant. However, when African Americans were referred to as uppity by non-African Americans, specifically white Americans, it was just an African American who had sound self-esteem, the type of self-esteem people are just kind of supposed to have. Someone who was self-confident, somebody who lived their life via self-determination, business owners, landowners, homeowners, people who didn't understand themselves as naturally inferior to whites. This is what was referred to as an uppity Negro, and that was the crime that got people lynched. So whites did not know how to deal with all of these new freed slaves, these freed blacks, these So, in order to remedy themselves of these freed African Americans, they decided to go on a reign of terror, which was basically these extrajudicial killings. It's very hard for me to say that with Invisalign aligners in my mouth. But African Americans were becoming economic competition for whites. So let's say maybe you were shopping at a white-owned grocery store. Now you're shopping at a black-owned one. Maybe you were going to a white-owned institution for X, Y, or Z need, and now you're buying that from your own people. Because remember, there's also, segregation. You don't belong here, blah, blah, blah. So you have a lot of black people supporting black-owned businesses. And the whites felt like that was taking money out of their hands and out of their pockets and a threat to their way of life. So they would catch and beat and rape and burn these men and hang them from trees as a way to enforce the white supremacist idea that blacks ought to be second-class citizens. However, when this was done, people would just say, oh, well, this man raped a white woman, or this man was a murderer, so this is why this lynching is appropriate. And Ida B. Wells knew that that was nonsense, but what's significant about her is that she proved it. So Ida B. Wells is arguably the first investigative journalist because she would investigate all of the facts and interview, witnesses and different people who knew and who were around and publish this information. And she couldn't be debunked because she told the truth with unflinching integrity. And I would say she was a figure that I would liken to Malcolm X, just because people saw her as a radical, people saw her as a rebel rouser, people saw her as someone, black people saw her as someone that made sense, but, white people were just, saw her as like a race baiter, when in reality, her ideas were sound. So you see now, there are all kinds of programs and streets and all kinds of dedications to Ida B. Wells, but at the time, she would have to move from one city, state, or house to another because her life was being threatened for this truth that she told. So one of the pamphlets that she published was Southern Horrors, lynching in all of its phases. And then she also published something called, I believe it was called The Red Book. So in 1890, Southern states, beginning with Mississippi, decided to pass all different types of legislation in order to keep African Americans and, consequentially poor whites as well, out of power. So while the lynchings were serving to cull the numbers of African Americans who, you're talking like laws where it's like, oh, you're 3/5 of a human being, and they would African Americans being 3/5 of a human being, right? Because we weren't seen as human, we were seen as property. So they would fill these states with all these African Americans, and then now all these Southern, Democrats or whatever they were, had more voting power, right? And that's how that worked. And once they were free, they were surrounded by all these free people who were unlike them. So it's like, well, what do we do? So part of what they did was, the extrajudicial killings, which are lynchings. And then another part of that was literacy tests. And now you can't vote unless you have one of these. And you can't do this unless you have that. Like they would insert all these arbitrary kind of, well, not so arbitrary laws and complicate the process of self-determination, complicate the process of voting and having a right to access certain things in your own community. So now you hear about things like redlining and gerrymandering, and these are all children of stifling the political process of African Americans. So I just called that book, I just called another one of her pamphlets The Red Book. It was actually called The Red Record. And it was a much more detailed, much more gruesome record of lynchings that took place between 1877 and 1950. So just in the South alone, over 4,080 something African Americans were lynched. So when people are saying, oh, you guys are crying about slavery, this happened a long time ago, Reconstruction was really not that long ago. More acts of violence were committed against African Americans after the institution of chattel slavery than during it. During slavery, African Americans were seen as too much of there was too much value. Like, that's $1,000 right there. Don't kill it. That's a investment. That's an 18-year investment. Don't kill it, right? But once they became free and began to do their own thing, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say this. So there were the horrors of centuries of slavery, but then there were the horrors of being freed. And there was more violence enacted against the bodies of African Americans after slavery than during slavery. So you've heard about the different things that happened in slavery. You've heard about the whips and the chains and XYZ. It was more of a violent situation after they were freed than when African Americans were held as captives. And one of the things white men did, who were kind of insecure about this power struggle, or what they figured would become this emerging power struggle, was project their own crimes onto African American men. So these white men who owned a number of slaves were regularly raping black women. Order of the day, nothing out of the ordinary. And so in order to get a crowd angry enough to burn a man alive and rape him in front of a crowd, they would say, oh, this man, committed this rape against this woman, If you've heard of Lake Lanier, it was destroyed after it was said that an innocent black man raped a white woman. If you've heard of Central Park in New York, it was established. It was a black town, a black city that had been burnt down and destroyed after the claiming of a white woman being assaulted by a black man. If you've heard of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it was bombed and destroyed after the false accusation. So this is why Ida B. Wells called this that threadbare excuse of black men raping white women, right? Because in reality, black men were not just going around raping white women. They were too afraid. They had just gotten done being owned by them. They had just gotten done being owned by these people living in their homes or on their land and on their farms, and they knew what kind of danger they posed to them. So there are so many different places in America that are these beautiful monuments, and if you listen to the story behind them, even Wall Street itself, they call it Wall Street because they lined up a bunch of African American bodies on a wall and sold them on auction blocks. So this is the problem with critical race theory, because none of it's nice, and it's not exactly a cheery subject, but it must be talked about because these are the people, these are the bodies, these are the legs that our nation stands on. These are the people who fought to make America truly a nation of free people who have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, Ida B. Wells, she lectured all over the world. Not all over the world. She lectured internationally. One thing that worked really well against the white society of the South and of America in general is shame among other white people. So she would go to Britain and tell those white people how bad these white people were. And they were just like, aghast at the things that were happening in America. And Southern whites were so proud of lynching African Americans, at least among one another, that, there's all kind of postcards with, hanging black bodies. You have the song about the lynching in Marion, Indiana by Billie Holiday, a song that was written for her called Strange Fruit. And anytime she tried to perform this song, people would try to dissuade her or throw her out or do something, and she never shied away from singing the song because it had because the song, much like Ida B. Wells' writing, helped to spread awareness about what was really going on. So anyhow, Ida B. Wells' work was just really instrumental and pivotal in getting people to understand what was really going on with African Americans in the South. She started to write her autobiography, but she passed away before publishing it. It was posthumously published by her daughter later on in life as The Crusade for Justice, autobiography of Ida B. Wells. So, I think I got through that. Ida B. Wells was buried in the south side of Chicago. There is an African American History Museum held at one of the homes she lived in back in Mississippi. And I believe there is something similar in Memphis. I could be wrong, but I wrote an article about it, and basically the information that I collected, I have, I'm going to link below so that if I said anything wrong here from memory, that it will be corrected at the bottom. But let's see. I don't think I'm going to cover the beef between Ida B. Wells and Susan B. Anthony because this ain't about Susan. But Ida B. Wells very famously was marching in a women's suffrage march and was told to, basically, there was still segregation, so she was told to go where all the black people were. But she was just like, bruh, I'm marching with the women of my chapter, with the women of the organization that I started. And that's another thing. Ida B. Wells often ran for political office, and I think it was W.E.B. Du Bois or Booker T. Washington, who basically, she was a part of the founding of the NAACP, but, you know, while he said that she voluntarily chose not to be written down as a founder, she was like, nah, he took my name off of there, and I would believe her any day over, you know, either one of those two, because she literally, her word was as good as scripture. And that was the real threat, because she was so honest with such unflinching integrity, and people were afraid of her, right? This little woman, I'll try to put a picture of her in the thumbnail. This little woman people feared because of her tongue, you know, the power of what she could do. Sometimes she would lecture in Europe or in Britain and in Scotland and Ireland, and it would be to an audience of thousands of people, easily. Thousands of people. And when she spoke on some E.F. Hutton, when I talk, people listen, right? Preceding him. Anyhow, one moment. The last thing that I wanted to say about Ida that really moves me is that she fought even when she was alone. This is a woman who spoke truth to power until she died. And she was ostracized at times by the people who she fought for. There was even a court case where Ida B. Wells was dragged off of a first-class train, right? You know, the conductors, these white people asked her to move to the smoking car. And she's like, I have a first-class ticket. I'm going to be riding first class. No, I'm not going anywhere. And they dragged her off of a train. She hired a black lawyer to represent her. That person was paid off by the other side. And then she ended up having to hire a white lawyer, right? And that just goes to show you that not all skin folk are kinfolk. And then the opposite can also be true, right? Because it was a white Quaker who oftentimes hooked her up with some of these speaking engagements. And, you know, Frederick Douglass at the time was really very elderly. So there were times where he would be called to speak somewhere and he would replace himself with Ida B. Wells. So that just goes to show what manner of woman this was. Now that that part of the conversation is done, I want to say really very quickly, or do I want to add that? Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should just leave it this way. Comment below your favorite attribute of Ida B. Wells, and I will comment.
Chocolate. It's either chocolate or it ain't. It's either chocolate or it ain't.